Let's talk about the Canon RP, who it's for, and is it still worth buying? This is the camera that first started my YouTube channel about 3 or 4 years ago. I tested the 4K capabilities on this. I recently rebought it on Marketplace for $450 and seeing that it's $600 like used on eBay right now, I kind of wanted to see if it's still worth picking up. The Canon RP was notoriously hated on for its video capabilities, and for me, I didn't know any better at the time, so I was shooting music videos with it when I was over living in China, and I'll link some of those here, but I found it to be a really good camera to learn on because the autofocus wasn't great. I had to manually focus, but we'll get more into that later in the video. Let's start first with the pros. Oh, and at the end of this video, we'll compare the Canon R50 and the R10 because they're newer but still within this price range, so it might be a route that you want to go as well. Starting first with the pros of the Canon RP, you get a 26 megapixel sensor, which is amazing for even professional work. It shoots amazing raw photos, and the color science is really amazing out of it as well. Secondly, this camera has the ability to shoot 4K, but unfortunately the pros kind of end there, and we'll talk about the 4K deficiencies a little bit when we get to the cons. The third pro is that there's many adapters that you can get for the RF to EF mount, so that allows you to save a lot of money on lenses and use your old EF glass. Really quick, if you're finding value in this video, it goes a really long way if you could just leave a like. 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much, and let's dive back in. The Canon RP also sports a fully articulating flippy screen, which is pretty cool because at the time there wasn't a ton of cameras that are doing that, but we see it more and more now, especially on newer cameras. It's pretty standard. It also has a really good touchscreen as well. Another pro that I'll bring up is that this thing is really easy to travel with. It's lightweight, compact, portable, and at a $600 price range, you're not too worried about like breaking it, losing it, so that's kind of good about this as well. Another reason I was drawn to this camera when I first picked it up in 2020 was that it has not only a mic input but also a headphone jack as well. I was trying to get into like the hybrid space, so photo and learn video while I do my photography, and that allowed me to start to understand audio as well in terms of not only like playing with the levels of the gain but also monitoring levels as well. So I found that pretty cool for an entry-level camera. For both photography and video up to 1080p, the dual pixel autofocus does an amazing job on this camera, and it wasn't anything that was compromised except for in the 4K video. The last two things I want to talk about is the custom dials on this. So you get a custom 1, 2, and 3 on the dial switch, which is really cool. It allows you to play within like the photo and video and switch easily back and forth from different resolutions for video. I found that really cool. Then it also has just like some scroll wheels as well that you can assign for different things, and oftentimes on RF lenses as well. The control ring that you can find on some of the RF glass will allow you to adjust other exposure settings as well. Finally, for being released in 2019, the fact that it has a USB-C and that supports charging is actually super cool as well. So it's not all rainbows and sunshines with the Canon RP, and the first con that I'll talk about is the 4K capability. Specifically when it comes to autofocus, it's absolutely terrible. It's garbage. It's the contrast based autofocus, so you lose that dual pixel autofocus. What I recommend doing if you're going to use 4K on this camera at all, and like I did when I shot the music videos, I would just go to manual focus mode and then turn on peaking, and that allowed me to just kind of like learn how to manually focus, and it was the only reliable way to get good content. I recently went to a car show with my Canon RP, and I found this guy with this super cool Volkswagen van.
This is a 77 Volkswagen Westie.
When I got home and I put my footage into Final Cut, I found that it was missing something, mainly because it's an older camera, and when I get footage that I don't absolutely love, namely from like a GoPro or an older camera, what I like to do is I like to add for 1, cinematic borders, and 2, LUTs. And I used to spend hours online trying to figure out how to get those cinematic borders into my Final Cut, and then finding the proper LUTs and generators to make that work with Final Cut. But with Motion Array, they made it so easy, and they're today's channel sponsor. If you're a beginner filmmaker, you have to check them out. All I had to do was go to Motion Array, get a subscription, and download the hub. Once I have the hub, I have access to over 50 different assets that work with my Final Cut, and it's absolutely amazing. So in this case, with the Canon RP footage from the Westphalia van, I just dragged and dropped it on, and I instantly have cinematic borders, but I also have LUTs as well. It doesn't stop there. I get an S curve as well, so I can adjust my contrast. I have access to grain grain tools and also vignetting, and then I can also play around with the colors and exposure right in that one plugin. If you want to save $50 off an annual subscription, all you got to do is click the link in my description below. Thank you so much, and let's dive back into the cons of the Canon RP. Also, another big con in 4K is that you get a pretty massive crop, and then if you want to turn on any kind of active stabilization as well, this camera doesn't have in-body image stabilization but has like an electronic version, you get an even bigger crop. The second con is for full frame sensors. Canon still hasn't allowed for third-party manufacturers like Sigma and Tamron to enter the party and offer cheaper lenses. They did do this for their APS-C line, so that's kind of nice. And then we also talked about like that EF to RF adapter. Just allows you to put your old EF glass and save a little bit of money on the lenses. The Canon RP for slow motion isn't amazing. You can't do any slow motion really in 4K, and you get 1080p up to 60 frames per second, which you can then slow to 40% on a 24-second timeline. So I guess that's kind of cool, but it's kind of like crippled in terms of what it can do for slow motion functionality, unless you're okay with 1080-60. We talked briefly about the lack of image stabilization within this camera, but the electronic stabilization, if you can handle like a little bit of a crop, is actually pretty impressive for what they were able to do. So that's kind of like a pro and con. The next point is that while this camera is really good for travel in terms of size, it actually isn't good in terms of weather sealing, so that's a little bit of an issue for a lot of people. So you just have to be really mindful of that when shooting in harsh conditions. The next point is that this camera is dated in terms of even like 1080p quality, and you only get 8-bit and you don't get log profiles or anything like that. So it is definitely dated compared to what's out there in terms of video quality in this price range. The next point I'll bring up is that battery life is just okay. For me, when I owned this camera and I was using it professionally, I always just had 3 batteries on me just in case. You could get through a day of photography use if you're like being a tourist in a new town or whatever, but you'd have to probably shut off your camera in between uses. And lastly, online they talk a lot about like the noise levels in terms of photography and what you get out of this camera. So it'll introduce noise a lot quicker in low light situations, but I shot in nightclubs for 2 years in China, and I never really had an issue with that. Plus there's really good easy to use noise reduction tools through Lightroom and stuff, so not a huge concern. Now, if you are a hybrid shooter, you might want to consider the R50 or R10. Although those are just APS-C sensors, you do get a little bit better features in terms of video, and the photography is great on those as well. And then if you're video first only, I would say like probably go the R8, because it's still like a budget level hybrid camera, but it's like way better in terms of like getting cinematic footage, because it's like 10-bit, better frame rates, and it also shoots log. So as promised, let's do a quick comparison of the Canon RP with the R10 and R50, because they're somewhat in that price range. So the biggest one is that you're getting a full frame sensor for a pretty cheap price on this camera. So that's the biggest one for photography. In terms of videography, you get 8-bit on this camera only, but you have 10-bit modes on the R50 and R10, which is really cool if you like color grading your footage at all. All 3 of these options don't offer C-Log, so you're not going to be able to get like the best cinematic look out of these cameras, albeit there is ways to do it in neutral profiles and add cinematic borders and things like that. We talked about the R10 and R50 being better in terms of video because of the 8-bit and 10-bit, but also you're just getting way better 4K capabilities in terms of like getting proper autofocus in 4K, and then you're not getting like major crops when you're in 4K 30. And one strange pro of the Canon RP that you don't get with the R10 and R50 is that you get a headphone monitoring jack in terms of audio levels, and you won't get that on the R10 and R50. If you're still not sure which camera to buy, or you're on a tighter budget, consider checking out the... Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate you, and we'll see you in the next video. Matty out. Peace.